All right, another lecture here in 1301 history. This one encompasses the Calvinist a little more. Also, it's going to talk. We're going to spend a lot of time talking about the English Reformation and its impact upon those who are going to come to North America in these years. So, if we begin this lecture today, we'll pick back up in Calvinism a little more than the last lecture. It's fair to remember that John Calvin and his Calvinistic thinking is going to be really probably the more important impact upon American English tradition, the American Anglo society than say Martin Luther. And I know I said that very clearly. But John Calvin was very systematic in the way he thought and the way he acted. In fact, actually, one of the more influential books in American history, at least in some religious circles, I'll say this correctly, certainly in Protestant history, which would, of course, impact many of those who come to North America for religious reasons, would be the Institutes of the Christian Religion. Calvin is going to start to write that in his 20s, and he finishes it by the time he dies, and it's extensive. The Institutes of the Christian Religion, sitting on my shelf over there, I'm looking up at it right now as I record this. This font is about as tiny as a speck of sand, seems like, and it's about this long. The Institutes of the Christian Religion are systematic, and in many respects explain what it means to be a Protestant. Now, not every not every Protestant is going to subscribe hook, line, and sinker to the Institutes of the Christian Religion, but in many respects it is the first and one of the fullest explanations and defenses of what it means to be a Protestant Christian. And so to this day, you will see men and women who are training for seminary who, especially obviously coming out of a more Reformed or Calvinistic background, are going to spend time studying those institutes of the Christian religion. It's not the only thing you study, but it's certainly there. But there's a systematic aspect to Calvin and his followers that you do not find with Luther. Luther's descendants will become systematic. It's just what you do is the movement matures. But very systematic. It's also fair to say, too, that if Rome is the heart of the Catholic faith, and I understand Vatican City is within Rome and it's a separate entity to itself, but if Rome is the heart of the Roman Catholic Church, I mean, obviously the name kind of says it as much, for our future Puritans, our Reformed or Calvinistic followers, their heart or their home is Geneva. So in that sense, if it's kind of analogous to Mecca or analogous to Rome, Geneva, the city in Switzerland, Geneva is extraordinarily important to Calvinism because that's where obviously Calvin was, but you're going to see a lot of men go to Calvin and study under Calvin or his subordinates, and they will be trained and then sent out to various parts of Europe, and their legacy would be, of course, felt across the Atlantic Ocean to North America. And so here we are, say, in the mid-1500s, 1536 to 1559 are the institutes, Calvin himself. So we're mid-1500s territory. And the stuff of the Protestant Reformation is still just coming along. There are some other things I want to point out to you about major differences between Protestants generally speaking, Calvinists particularly speaking, and the Roman Catholic Church. This is that division point stuff that I have alluded to or said over time. One of the things is that the big division point, obviously, as I've already said, number one would be who is the head of the church. Protestants, almost to a denomination or a man, would argue it is Jesus as the head of the church, and they would point to various scriptures in the New Testament. Catholics, on the other hand, would say, no, it is the Pope who's the head of the church, and so forth, and they'd point to Scripture as well. In addition to that, and tradition, to be fair, in addition to that, almost to a man would say the exception to a degree of the Lutherans and certainly the Anglicans, which are like saying Episcopalians in the United States, but certainly say amongst, for those of you who grew up, Assembly of God, Baptist, or something like one of those two, Methodist as well for all intents and purposes, and I know the Methodist movement comes out of the Anglican movement as well. But they're going to reject the idea of a sacramental system by which that is one of the means or the chief means of procuring grace to you is through participation in the sacramental system. So there's a major difference right there. Sacraments, yes, to the Catholic Church, and for that matter, no to most Protestants or almost all Protestants, at least when it comes to the conferring of grace. So that, by the way, you might even make a little note of this too. A sideline of that is that, of course, the Catholic Church puts a very heavy emphasis, a big emphasis on the sacraments with regard to, say, marriage. Marriage is valued and important and so forth in the various Protestant churches, but oftentimes you'll find them because if the Catholics do one thing, Protestants often will do the other and go the opposite direction. And so what they would say is that yes, marriage is important, but it is not a sacrament. It is a covenant. It is not a sacrament. It can be even, say, a civil affair. You'll see the Puritans, who are very religious. They are here to set up their city upon a hill in their society. They enforce marriage quite rigidly, but as a general rule, you do not have marriage in Puritan churches. They don't do that. You go down to the civil magistrate and you get married by effectively a judge. So that would be another difference right there. Also, something else is worth noting, and I won't belabor this point. You could do a lot with this. But the fact of the matter is that when you talk about the difference between Protestants and Catholics has to do with architecture. And I will talk, I guess I should say this, I will talk more about architecture, especially when I talk about the Puritans directly. But for those of you who have visited other churches or grew up in one type of church and went with a friend to a different church, some of you, this does not apply, but understand the interior of the church, the layout of the sanctuary or the worship center or whatever you call it, kind of indicates kind of what you're up to. In the Catholic Church, then as now, the furniture is a little different, but the layout of a Catholic church is certainly centered around or pointed toward the altar. The altar is where the Mass is said. The altar is where the Eucharist is celebrated, and it's not, to my knowledge, on Catholic dogma, it is not superior to the others. They're all the sacraments are important. But the sacrament that a Catholic takes most frequently is probably going to be the sacrament of the Eucharist, the sacrament of Mass. And so that is the center of Catholic practice. It's where the Mass is said, and where the host and the wine become the body and the blood. But if you travel to a Protestant church, a Presbyterian church, a Baptist church, or a congregational church, many of the different types that are out there, less so true with the Episcopalians or the Lutherans. But even still there, you get a feel for it. But especially Presbyterians and Baptist and congregational, Disciples of Christ, Church of Christ, etc., you're going to see the architecture of the church laid out very differently. The center of attention in those places are going to be the pulpit or going to be some sort of lectern or something like that, normally a pulpit in an antique sense, where the Word of God is preached. So preaching takes center stage in those Protestant churches, whereas in the Catholic Church, you're going to see the sacraments take center stage, especially the sacrament of the Eucharist. In addition to that, also in those architectural layouts of the church, in addition to seeing what's the focus of the architecture, the pews or the seats or whatever, pointing towards something. In a Catholic church, you're going to see stained glass, particularly potentially stained glass with saints on them. And so let's be clear about this. The Catholic Church venerates saints, and saints would be those particularly holy, particularly blessed, particularly used, and I mean this in the best way, used individuals who have demonstrated uncommon devotion, uncommon blessing by God. And so you'll have Saint Augustine or Saint Joan of Arc or Saint Mary or saints, various and sundry things. The fact of the matter is that when you talk about that, you do not see Protestants use the word saint in the same way, especially the more you go to, say, a Methodist, Baptist, Church of Christ, Disciples of Christ, and so on, Presbyterian certainly. The fact of the matter is that when Protestants, almost to a man again, say the word saint, they do not refer to saint as this venerated, now dead individual who's gone on to his greater reward. Not like a Saint John Paul II, for example, like a Catholic would. The term saint is far more commonly meant, and frankly means in the Protestant language of the believers who are living, the saints, because it's a reference to the Bible and fidelity of the Bible. Another big difference right here is the veneration of Mary. That is a very big difference between Catholics and Protestants. Protestants at least ought to or should respect Mary. She is a very good woman. The Magnificat is clearly is meant to be a beautiful example out of the New Testament. Yet Protestants do not hold Mary up as this as a woman who was sinless and completely pure, as do Catholics. And the understanding of Mary in Catholic dogma has grown and I won't say evolved, but has grown over time. And Mary is very, very important. Say a Hail Mary, for example, in confession. Some of you know exactly praying the rosary that is in there. So the differences on Mary. The role of a priest in Protestant expression, especially like, say, in the form of a Protestant such as a Baptist, would say a preacher is perhaps called out and set aside to the gospel ministry, but he has no special power. He does not have any special thing that he can give you to heal or what have you. What he is there, he's a minister and he preaches the word. And that's his tool. Whereas the Catholic Church would offer a reconciliation, and honestly, just looking at the uniform, to use a term, the uniform of a Baptist minister, which can be a coat and tie or even just an open collar shirt like I've got on right now, versus the vestments or the black coat with the collar of the Catholic priest. And I just use Baptist versus Catholic, but Protestants have very different views of what the role of the priest is. It's particularly when it comes to confession. Basically, you can say it like this. Protestants, generally speaking, confess to God directly. They believe there is no need for a priesthood, a formal priesthood in that sense, or as it's said in Protestant circles, the priesthood of the believer, whereas Catholics have that. The five solas, that should be on your review sheet for an exam that you're getting from me. The five solas, the Catholics would disagree in particulars and in the general on those five solas, but when we say the five alones, the five touchstones of the Protestant Reformation would include how is it all done, or why is it all done? It is through Jesus alone, through the Bible alone, Word of God, and Catholics would disagree on the use of the Bible, as I've said very clearly in class, kind of the three-legged stool versus the Bible alone, Catholic versus Protestant. The Bible alone, grace through grace alone, by faith alone, and for the glory of God alone. And so those are two different divisions right there. And so, and like I said, the Bible is viewed differently. And in fact, actually, if you did not know this, the Bible itself is different from a Catholic Bible to a Protestant Bible. There are about a half a dozen less books of the Bible in the Protestant Bible. And so if you have a Bible that was given to you by your family member because of accepting faith in Jesus Christ, say in a Baptist sense, that's going to be a Catholic that is going to be, a Protestant Bible. The reality is, too, when we talk about Protestantism and so forth, is that there is also the issue of heaven and hell. Protestants, as a general rule, believe that there is heaven and there is hell and there is an afterlife. Catholics believe there is an afterlife, but as we've already said in class, heaven, purgatory for those who are believers, and hell for those who are not. So there is a separatism there. And last but not least, I use the word separatism. The reality is that when we talk about the separatism, you really see it with Protestants, and especially certain types of Protestants who were persecuted, even in Protestant countries. You will see this particular vein of separatism, holiness, reformation, desire to purify the church, purify the community of the and in a sense go on a crusade. You see it throughout our history, American history, in the form of moral reform oftentimes, religious reform at times. You saw it with the Puritans. Frankly, you saw it in the alcohol stuff of the late 19th and early 20th century, Prohibition. But the idea, though, is that a lot of those who eventually become the largest denomination in America, the Baptist and the Methodist, they start out as outsiders, and they carry that with them. And they want to not have a society that is corrupted, is like... It is like the old Church of England. It is like the old Roman Church and so forth. So they looking to create the proverbial city upon a hill, reform society. They push a moral code, which sometimes catches fire and sometimes burns out. It ebbs and flows. But understand this. So the reason we bring all this up is not just for an exercise in religious history. There is the need to know what people believe and what is the general tapestry and I call it sometimes the potpourri, but certainly the diversity of the religious tapestry of the future United States. But you will, if you ever wonder why do we go on crusades, and I don't mean that literally like crusades of the Holy Lands, but sometimes it seems that way. I think it's just in our DNA because at least some faction, and a very prominent faction out of New England, the Puritans, they would go on crusades to reform in their community or reform a larger nation. That doesn't have to be religious necessary, these crusades, but sometimes they have the overtone to it. So when we get our righteous fury up as Americans, sometimes we're channeling our inner Puritan, it seems like. But Calvin and Calvinism, Geneva and so forth, is really it's going to separate itself away and push a lifestyle and a full choice and a full like I said, lifestyle, a full life. It's a worldview. I mean, it's not just church on Sunday sort of thing. It is designed to be a transforming thing that you are never quite the same again, frankly. You'll see out of Geneva some prominent names go forward. Obviously, we've used Calvin several times. Please put this next name in your notes. The man's name is John Knox, Knox. So if you come from the Presbyterian tradition, which comes mostly from Scotland anyways, the Scottish Presbyterians, they looked at John Knox as kind of a father figure. He was the father of Scottish Presbyterianism in a sense. Doesn't mean he was always beloved, and at times he was fired because he was a little too strident on his religion. But at the same time, if you see in American history a name like Knox, oftentimes, especially if the town or the community is old enough, say if it goes back into the 1700s, it was settled by some of the Scottish immigrants, there's probably a good indication that they were strong Presbyterians, or at least they knew their heritage and would name a child after John Knox, amongst others. Andrew for the Scottish immigrants was also a very prominent name too. So the St. Andrew's Cross flag of Scotland, for example. That the fact of the matter is that John Knox he's going to be like a missionary from Geneva, and he's going to take with him, put this in your notes if you haven't already, he's going to take with him the Geneva Bible. The Geneva Bible, so you know, is the first major translation of the Protestant Bible from the original tongues of Hebrew and Greek, which was commonly translated there in Geneva. It acts as also a Bible tract society at times too. And the Geneva Bible was the favorite Bible of our Puritans that are going to land in Massachusetts and Connecticut and New Hampshire. That was their go-to Bible. That was their favorite. There will be the other translation of the King James, but we'll talk about that more in a bit. But at the same time, the Geneva Bible should kind of give you an idea how important that is. And so, again, I guess I can't underestimate or rather overemphasize the issue of the Bible. Protestants, the Bible is central, at least it was in times gone by, whereas the Catholic Church would say, yes, the Bible is important, the Scriptures are important, but they're just one part of the three-legged stool of which your faith rests upon. And so we have Calvin and Geneva settled up for our purposes today. But the fact of the matter is that when we talk about that we talk, oh, I almost forgot one thing. I just happened to look at one thing here. So we're clear, one other major difference. Sorry about this. I happened to look at a note that I didn't put down also in front of me. The fact of the matter is when we talk about differences, one other one has to be the ordinances. And I said about sacraments, but be clear about this. Say if you grew up Baptist or you grew up something Protestant, you would not call the Lord's Supper a sacrament, whereas, of course, the Catholic Church would. So the Lord's Supper, using the Baptist term, would be a major difference. So anyways, let's now talk about one of the things and one of the facets you get from the Protestant Reformation. And I've mentioned it, and we're going to start to turn it into a discussion about England. You're going to have religious wars that are going to come out of the Reformation, and because of the Reformation. So as I've said before, it's some nasty stuff. Some of the most hellish fighting will be taking place. And essentially for over 100 years, you will have on and off and oftentimes on conflicts between armed camps, Protestant versus Catholic. But in England particularly, England starts out, of course, in the Protestant Reformation as a Catholic nation. And some of you know the story of English Reformation well enough. The man in charge here of England in the time of the beginnings of the Protestant Reformation in the early to mid 1500s is Henry VIII. Henry VIII was a big man, charismatic, erratic, some would say half mad. Certainly he was aggressive, and he was a paranoid at times. He could certainly be influenced. Henry VIII was a physical specimen. I mean, in a time when people were short and kind of, compared to today, very short. Average male stood somewhere around 5'4", 5'5". Henry VIII was much larger, and he had a larger-than-life personality. There's that charisma that I just mentioned. But Henry, at the outbreak of the Protestant Reformation, Henry is the head of a second-rate empire. Not empire, excuse me, a second-rate kingdom. There's England, and Scotland and England hadn't really been unified yet. They don't have the United Kingdom just yet. The fact of the matter is England was a smallish realm compared to France or compared to Spain. Spain's obviously going up because of all the wonderful gold that's being mined out of Mexico, Peru, and elsewhere that I've already lectured on. But England is small, and so I want you to make note of that. England is no powerhouse. And Henry is a devout Catholic, as much as that matters. The thing is that when we talk about Henry, we got to remember is that the man, like I said, has a very much a appetite about him. And of course, he is always, like any man who is on a throne or is in a dynastic position, he is worried about his offspring. He's worried about his prodigy. What's going to happen when I die? And of course, it's common in European history, and it's frankly common elsewhere, to value the birth of and the growth of a child, a male child particularly. You see this to this day, people who will say, man, I really wanted a boy. And I don't necessarily, in a modern sense, perhaps, it depends on who you're talking to, frankly. They may not be saying, man, I regret having 2 girls or 3 girls or whatever it was, but they really wanted a boy. And there's that. And you'll also see occasionally, to be true, I've seen it in life, but you'll see women say, man, I wish I had a daughter, and she had 3 boys. But anyways, Henry, because of rules and practice of succession and so forth, and frankly some chauvinism against women, I'll grant, he wanted a boy. And but Henry, when he was a young man, early 20s territory, Henry is going to marry Catherine of Aragon. And the fact of the matter is that when we talk about Catherine, they marry in 1510, 1509 territory. Catherine's a few years older. The thing about Catherine of Aragon is that she is the widow of Henry's brother, Henry VII. And under the rules of the Catholic Church, which Henry was a part of at that point in time, it was generally frowned upon, and that's probably being a little bit light touched right there, but it was generally frowned upon for a brother to marry the widow of a brother to marry the widow of the brother. What I'm trying to say is one man to marry the brother's widow. There you go. How's that? Not saying you couldn't get remarried. It's just is that within the same family that should not take place. But let's see if I got the name down here. Clement the Seventh. Clement VII is going to have to do some fancy finagling with Catholic canon law to allow Henry VIII to marry Henry VII's widow, Catherine. But it got done. And so Catherine and Henry are married. Catherine and Henry have children, evidently about 6 of them. Only one will survive. Put her name down. Her name is Mary. Mary survives. She is the only surviving child of Henry and Catherine. The problem is that Catherine is getting older, and as Henry gets older himself, he looks around and basically says, we're not likely to have any more children. And to be clear about it, having children in that era was dangerous to a woman. And the older a woman got, it's just a hard time. Frankly, infant mortality rates were extraordinarily high, at least 50%, and in some areas 60 or 70%. Infant mortality means a child dies within the first year. So it's unlikely Henry's going to be having any more children, or at least he's worried he's not going to have a male child with Catherine. Now, Henry, to be clear, also kind of blames his wife for it. Henry blames Catherine for having all those girls. He doesn't know, and we don't know until I believe at least the 20th century. But we do not know that it is the male that kind of determines the sex of the child. Anyways, but he doesn't know that. And Henry, by about 1527, is going to ask for and promote an annulment from Catherine. And so understand this, remember this about Catholic dogma and theology or practice is that in Catholic dogma, marriage is a big deal and you do not get divorced. If the marriage is a legitimate marriage in the sense that there was no shenanigans in the background, there was no seemingly, basically acts that made it look like there was a lie or something of that nature going on, then other than that, when you're married in Catholic dogma and in the eyes of the church, you're married. As you now understand and sometimes people can and do get divorced, but that's a civil divorce in a modern sense. But Henry asked for an annulment from Catherine. He asked the church for an annulment, and he got sent to Rome. This is a high request. And Rome basically said, no, we can't give you the annulment because the Pope himself arranged the marriage in the first place. We're not going to sacrifice our credibility because you'd have not had a male child. And so Henry, stewing, he feels himself at times surrounded by Rome. He feels like he's being hemmed in, and there's also political actions in the background. And Henry, who is being goaded at times by some of his advisors, strikes out and says, that's it. He declares himself the head of the church, head of the new Church of England, a.k.a., for your notes, the Anglican Church. And so he declares himself the head, and he breaks with Rome. Which is interesting, by the way, because Henry had been given by the Pope the title Defender of the Faith, which, by the way, to this day, Elizabeth II, who is the longest reigning monarch in the history of England, Elizabeth II, she has that title herself, and her son, probably Charles, whenever Elizabeth dies, Charles, when he becomes King of England, will have that same title as well, or at least something akin to it. But when Henry, back to the Henry VIII, in about 1531 declares his break. I'm looking down at my note. Henry declares his break in 1531. Henry says, I'm going to keep this title. I am defending the faith. Well, it also is convenient because he also allows divorce for himself. Put that in your notes. When you talk about Anglicans and divorce, they are, especially as we investigate them here in the 1301 class, when we find the Cavaliers of Virginia coming to Virginia, they are Anglicans. And they believe in marriage, but they don't believe in divorce because it's forbidden by the Anglican Church. Only one man can get divorced, and that man's name is the king, in this case, Henry VIII. So what begins now with the divorce of Catherine carries on with one of the more tawdry and at times soap opera-like, and it's deadly, frankly, soap opera-like aspects of English royal history. Henry himself will have ultimately 6 wives, and it goes like this. So here's your jingle for you. Here's your story. The phrase is divorced, beheaded, died. Divorced, beheaded, survived. So Henry, his first wife, he divorces. His second wife, Anne Boleyn, is going to have her head cut off because Henry became convinced, and I say that, he may have become convinced and he may have just wanted to believe it because he would become tired of Anne and frankly the fact that she didn't have any male heirs either. And so divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. Anne is going to have her head cut off because she was accused of gross adultery while the king was playing tennis. It's a tawdry situation, to say the least. But Henry is going to have all of these various characters running around who are whispering in his ear, these advisors, some of whom were better men than others, many of whom were, frankly, fairly devious individuals. And Henry takes England into the Protestant fold. And so initially, when Henry was first on the throne, he spatted with Luther back and forth. Now, Henry becomes one of the leading voices, or at least his bishops become the leading voices of the Catholic, I get it all mixed up now, the Protestant movement. So that brings us back to one of those issues that I opened up with. What about the Bible? And as I keep saying to you, one of the old statements, it's not as true as it once was, but good Protestants read the Bible. And so if you are you've gone from a Catholic to now a Protestant nation, what do you do with the Bible? Well, we need to have an English translation. We're going to have an English Bible. And you're going to see a half a dozen versions come out. And Henry initially blesses the publication of the Bible into English. And so what ends up happening is that when you start publishing the Bible and people start to read it, and so put this next part in your notes, if you're going to have a Bible and you're going to insist upon people reading it, you're going to have to educate your people to read. So what happens in Protestant nations, more so than in Catholic nations, because of that division point on the Bible, you're going to see a lot of individuals be able to read in a very rudimentary fashion. And so the literacy rate in Protestant nations go up. I do not mean to say that everybody learns how to read and write. I don't. But at the same time, you will see a corresponding drive that pushes up literacy in these Protestant nations because of the issue of the Bible and to read it. But you also see in England, too, people fighting over interpretations. I mean, when I say fight, they're in pubs drinking, and they are arguing over the interpretation of Paul's, say, epistle to Romans or something like that. And so they end up getting into brawls. And so introducing the Bible into a community sometimes, especially under Henry, can be, rather hard on civil society. So Henry, who can sway, I don't say like swing like a weather vane, but he can be very erratic. He can go back and forth like a pendulum. Goes from, in the 1530s, now 1540s, he's going into... And Henry is saying basically, read the Bible, it's good for you, you need to do that. And then by the time you get to the 1540s, mid-1540s, he's saying, no, don't read the Bible under penalty of punishment, death, or what have you. In the meantime, he's marrying and divorcing and beheading wives and so forth, and he's having kids, of which there are really three that matter. The first one we'll mention is the boy who becomes Edward VII. And he was a sickly boy born of one of Henry's wives, Jane Seymour. The second daughter is from Catherine, whom I've already mentioned, Mary. And the last one is Elizabeth. So for all of Henry's maneuverings to get away from and not have a daughter succeed him, he ultimately fails. But Henry's time on the throne is very, very convulsive. It is very hard. It's not a pleasant experience and those sorts of things there. And Henry at times will persecute not just Catholics, he persecutes them, but he'll also crack down on dissident groups in the Protestant movement. He has people killed. I've used the expression before, and I'll use it here in this lecture. He has a tendency to eat his young. And I don't mean that literally. I mean it's just an expression. But basically, you get too close to Henry, before it's all said and done, there's a very good chance your head is on the old chopping block as well. It happened to numerous individuals, not just his wives. But Henry's so erratic, but he's a revolutionary figure and throws into the upheaval. So if you can see what I'm saying, and I've said about the Protestant Reformation, is that it creates a lot of trouble in Europe. It troubles Europe in the form of wars between kingdoms and seemingly civil war within kingdoms as well. And I just use England as the example. Because when Henry dies, who becomes the king? Well, the boy does. And Edward's sickly, and he dies when he's about age 15. Some say he had tuberculosis real bad. Others say he had a degenerative kidney or liver disease that killed him. No matter what it was, Edward the Sixth time on the throne is very, very limited. But so when we're interested here, the next one up is going to be Mary, and Mary's reign is frankly fairly brief. She's only going to be Queen Mary, also known as Bloody Mary, for about 5 years. Mary, put this in your notes, is Catholic. And Mary is going to have her sister Elizabeth, who would be a rival to the throne, tossed into the Tower of London. If you did not know this, the Tower of London serves as a political prison for much of the time of English history, a political prison. It can be a prison for bad criminals, but mostly political prisoners. Now, Elizabeth will not be executed by her sister, but Bloody Mary was hell-bent and determined to return England to its Catholic roots. She grew up Catholic, she was a convinced Catholic, and she wanted to go back that way. And so she will crack down on the Church of England. She will crack down on dissident Protestant groups. There will be fighting and so forth, and she uses the instrumentality of her position to try to drag England back into the Catholic fold. The problem is that she's not going to live long enough, and had she done it, she might have been able to pull it off. But Henry's decade and a half based, let me think a second, 1531, about almost 2 decades as a Protestant prince or a Protestant king is going to have been long enough to create a Protestant England. Even if it is flawed, it's rambunctious, it's fighting, and on I can go. The fact of the matter is that Mary doesn't stay long enough and live long enough to change it. But while she does gain the nickname of Bloody Mary. And so when she dies and dies without any children, the fact of the matter is that when she passes, her successor is her sister, who's brought out of the tower and put onto the throne, Elizabeth I, who never marries. The thing about Elizabeth is that she makes the determination that for her, in order to be the monarch she believes she needs to be for England, and she is a devout Protestant, so we're clear. She is a supporter of the Protestant Reformation. She is a member of the Anglican Church. She takes all that seriously, but she also takes her power seriously too. And she, like most people, regardless of sex, when given power, aren't really all that interested in sharing it with others. It's uncommon to see a monarch or a president share power with others on some sort of crude co-equal idea. She is called the Virgin Queen, but she obviously had suitors and basically boyfriends and beaux, people she kept, but she never married. She never married. And so for that reason, she was called the Virgin Queen, but everybody who knew her knew better. But she is also going to be the queen when the Spanish try to float their armada up into the English Channel and try to invade England, and it becomes a great disaster and begins the decline and fall of Spain. It takes a long time for the decline and fall of Spain, but the Spanish Armada and that Protestant wind, as the English celebrate, basically are going to kind of note the beginning rise of England. I don't want to make it sound like England's becoming the Great Britain overnight. It takes a while. But you can start to see historically the plateau and eventually decline of Spain after the Armada fails and fails spectacularly. And you can start to see under Elizabeth and continuing after her the slow and sometimes halting, but slow but steady rise of England, later Great Britain, meaning the marriage of England, Scotland, Wales, and so forth, the United Kingdom, into what will become the British Empire. And so Elizabeth, is going to go down in history, and this is a very brief overview of her reign. She reigns, I'm looking at a note from right here off the side of at the corner of my eye. She reigns for effectively 45 years. And I say that, about 45 years. So, anyways, for all that to say is that Elizabeth is an extraordinarily consequential woman in the realm of religion. She affirms Anglicanism, and considering things, she will not let the Catholic princes or a Catholic faction in the United Kingdom or England get too far ahead of her, and she's not going to let them cause a threat to her. But at the same time, you do not get just a wanton crushing of the Catholics, or for that matter, other Protestants under Elizabeth. I'm not to say it is as tolerant as we would like it to be, but I am saying it's not rooting out all the Catholics and driving them into the ocean. At least that's my reading of Elizabeth's history. But when Elizabeth dies, that brings us on further along, and I'm kind of moving quickly through this. So when we talk about Elizabeth, and she passes from the scene, no children, no heir, so you're cast about looking for another heir. And so the next man up is going to be James, King James. King James the Sixth, King James the First. King James the Sixth is King James the Sixth of Scotland. And James the Sixth, put this in your notes, is reared and raised by or taught by Scottish Presbyterians. Back to that issue of Calvinism, back to that issue of religion. There's a lot of politics, obviously, in the religion. So this is all going back and forth. This isn't just a story of who goes to church where. But the Calvinist, the Reformed boys, thought, my gosh, this is God setting the table for us. We're going to get our man on the throne of England, and he's going to unify Scotland and England. And guess what? We're going to have our version of Protestantism take the chain. Because by the time you get to 1603 or so, when James takes the throne, a lot of Protestants, put this in your notes, a lot of Presbyterian types, a lot of Reformed Calvinist types had looked upon the Church of England, please write this down, as corrupt, rotten, wicked, at times almost no better, maybe worse than the old church at Rome, the old Roman Catholic Church. You will see amongst the Calvinists a real disdain, if not outright hatred and desire to crush and drive out the Church of England. They want to set up a reformed society, a whole society based off of the Bible as they understood it. They have a very definite vision. Some of the early Puritans would have been supporters of James as well. And so when you think, you're like, we trained James. We reared him up. He's been a good Calvinist. He's going to be one of our guys. So that when James, who takes the throne in 1603 as the king of England and Scotland, a united kingdom now, it was a great deal of surprise to the Reformed Calvinist boys when they found out that their chosen monarch, their favored son, was really not going to go upset the apple cart and drive the Anglicans into the ocean. He was not going to establish a Presbyterian Calvinist beachhead in London. He wasn't going to do that. To be honest about James the First, or James the Sixth of Scotland, of course, James the First, let's just call him that. But to be honest about King James, he was a strange man. He had quirks of his personality. I would say he was probably bisexual, but at the same time, that's an arguable point. He certainly is prone to doing strange things. For example, when he's headed south out of Scotland to England to take the throne, he's going to lay down over the border between England and Scotland to show everybody that in his body, England and Scotland had been unified. And it was bizarre, to say the least. And he is also going to be consequential because of his being the first of those monarchs. But the fact is that when we talk about James the First, maybe his most consequential act as king wasn't just that he decided to keep the Anglican Church or the Church of England as the dominant force, but he's also going to deny his Presbyterian Calvinist teachers one of their most prized and most hoped for, longed for plum assignments. The Presbyterians, the Calvinists, wanted James to adopt the Geneva Bible as the official Bible of the realm. And this is big because in that time period, and even today you can find it because I've got more than a few Bibles, as you could guess, I suppose. But there is a special seal that is given, and it's given commonly today. It's not like it's a big deal, but back then, if the king or the queen adopted a Bible or said this is the translation for the realm, that's what the one. That you didn't have a New Living Translation, a NIV, a Message, and this and that, and a study Bible here, and King James there, or whatever. The fact is that the king kind of called the tune on what Bible you had, and for the Presbyterians, they thought it was going to be the Bible. They thought it was going to be their Geneva Bible. The reality is that James was not that interested in it, and he certainly was not going to upset the apple cart and create a whole lot of trouble for himself by adopting the often fractious Presbyterian Calvinist preferred version. So what James does in about 1603, right after he becomes king, James basically does this, and he goes and he appoints a committee to create a new translation. And this new committee is going to take translations from here and there. One of the major Bible translators that was hounded into to death, actually, was eventually, I believe, burned at the stake, was William Tyndale, Tyndale. William Tyndale is going to have his translations, a lot of which put into the new, put this in your notes, authorized version. But if you noticed how I said those different translations of the Bible just a minute ago, one of the phrases I used was the King James Version. Now, that version right there, the King James, the James we're talking about right now, the King James Version is going to be the dominant English translation until the 20th century. From 1611, so put that date in your notes, from 1611 until essentially somewhere in the mid-20th century, and in certain circles, I mean, in common Southern Baptist churches and elsewhere, until the late 20th century, when you were a preacher, you preached out of the King James, regardless of whether it was still the best and people could understand every thee and thou. But it was the dominant translation for about 400 years. No, it's going to be about 300 years at least, maybe 400 years. But the fact of the matter is the King James Version is a big one right there. You will find that translation throughout the Great Awakenings. You'll find that translation especially in the Second Great Awakenings in the United States. But secondly, in a non-religious sort of manner, I wanted to bring this up to you as well. It also is going to help, I guess you could say, codify and to formalize the English language. All right, so when we talk about the King James Version, it has a lot of phrases, some of which are from Tyndale, some of which are from the translators, that are out there that is in common English usage to this day, and some of you use these phrases and had no clue that it comes from that Bible. What my point is simply is this, is that when we talk about these phrases, you sometimes will have things that start out in a religious sense, but then take on a completely secular understanding. It's the way language grows and changes. For an example, several here, some of which says a law unto themselves, a man after his own heart, a thief in the night, a thorn in the flesh. All of those probably you've heard before. Let's try a different one. How about someone said to you, some of you guys, especially probably as you were 15 and 16 and 17 years old, playing sports and pumping iron and running around and this and that, and you ate everything in sight. Heck, some of you probably still to this day eat everything in sight. And mom said to you once when she looked at her grocery bill, said, son, you are a bottomless pit. So that would be another one. Eat, drink, and be merry. The fatted calf. Get thee behind me. God forbid. Holier than thou. And let's see, here's some others. I'm just looking at, am I my brother's keeper? The land of milk and honey. Let there be light. Take root. Sheep in sheep's clothing, or wolf in sheep's clothing. Let's see. Signs of the times, the skin of my teeth. Born again. Two-edged sword. Vengeance is mine. Woe is me. And on we could go. There's a lot more than just that. But those are just some common phrases that are in the English language today that came out of the King James Version translation. It is probably the most important, it is, I would argue, the single most important document that makes modern English and creates a codified modern English. The only thing, or the only person who comes close, and you ought to write this down too, is somebody I particularly got burned on in high school because all I got was tragedies, and some of you got Romeo and Juliet. And you're thinking, oh, William Shakespeare. The only other thing documented that would come close to the King James as its impact is that of the that of that of William Shakespeare. So I would say also one other thing as we go, you'll see too, saying when you think of weddings, you can also say the Book of Common Prayer, which is an Anglican book, that too would have a role to play in the English language. But it doesn't come to the same level as the King James Version or, for that matter, Shakespeare. So anyways, that's a good place to stop, and we'll pick up in the next lecture, and we'll talk about those English Puritans who are going to come to North America to establish their city on a hill.